Tonight we are going to talk about Marshall Petain and the Vichy government. And when Charlie announced last month that you shouldn't hesitate to talk about a subject that somebody had talked about previously, I said, he's reading my mind. And then somebody in the crowd said, well, you could just read your old paper to the group. And I nearly laughed out loud at that one, because if you've seen the history of the papers that have been produced in this club, you will have noticed that in 2000, the year 2000 in May, Ben Cantrell did a program on Vichy France. But I promise you that I'm not going to read my old paper. 15 years ago. In fact, I doubt if I could find it. The topic continues to intrigue me, however, and I think even those of you who were here 15 years ago may learn something new. In fact, I was interested in that list because I looked at who had been given papers along about the same time, and the names that I could discover were Charlie and myself and Dick Hart, Jeff Cook, Ben Danzo, Kent Kiger. I don't know of anybody else that was here in the year 2000, but there may have been some of you. And so, but still, I hope that you will learn something new, because 15 years ago I was really interested in just the historical record of what happened in June of 1940. Tonight, and 15 years later, I am interested in why, and the why of what happened to France happened to them. Part though, as I did the last time, by telling you that my dad was a veteran of World War I. He fought in a field artillery division in France. And one of the bigger-than-life heroes that came out of that war was Marshall Petain, the hero of Verdun. And he's the one who vowed that they shall not pass, and they didn't. 30 years later, in 1945, when the old Marshal was on trial for his life, my dad expressed some sympathy for him, feeling that making peace with Germany and establishing a neutral government at Vichy was understandable under the circumstances in 1940. The 1940 invasion was, after all, the third time in the Marshal's life that France had been attacked by Germany. In 1870, the French had been humiliated by the German army and forced to give up Alsace-Lorraine, but it had survived. In 1914, France was able to stop the invasion at the Marne. I'm going to have to but the years between 1914 and 18 claimed the lives of millions of young Frenchmen. Only by massive help from their allies, Great Britain and the United States, did France manage to ultimately prevail. In 1940, after the conquest of Poland in September of 1939, and a few months of what William Shire calls Sitzkrieg in the West, the German army brought France to its knees by the middle of June. In fact, just a matter of 3 weeks, and the war was over as far as France was concerned. The suddenness of the collapse startled the whole world. Nobody believed that it would be that quick. So, my dad, Marshall Petain, had simply done the best he could under the circumstances, and should have been given some credit for stopping the bloodshed. It was written, I was interested in discovering for myself how much blame Marshall Petain deserved for the loss of France and the surrender. What I discovered was it wasn't the surrender itself that condemned the old Marshal, for after all, nearly every minister of the French government at that time in the first weeks of June in 1940 were in favor of giving up and making a deal with Germany. Everybody in the government, it was almost unanimous. Only the Prime Minister, I think, held out for some idea of carrying on the war, even if they had to go to North Africa and fighting from the colonies and that. Nobody thought they could do it. It wasn't like Churchill. If you remember, Churchill said, "We will fight on the beaches, we'll fight in the streets, and if we're kicked out of our island, we will carry on from the empire." Nobody in France wanted to do that. It wasn't that they surrendered, but it was a type of government, really, that the old Marshal created at Vichy, and its policies of collaboration with the Germans, and the Germany of Adolf Hitler, by the way, that condemned him. The Vichy government was not just a French government pushed out of its capital, but an autocratic regime that adopted most, but not all, of the attitudes of Nazi Germany. Town in south-central France, kind of like Red Boiling Springs, as a matter of fact. It was a resort town, and they marketed the Vichy water, which was thought to be have curative powers, and so they bottled it and sold it to people who thought that it was a remedy for lots of things. If you remember the movie Casablanca, and one of the last scenes where Major Strasser has been shot, and the Captain Renault is helping Rick get away. He's searching for a drink, and he picks up a bottle that says Vichy water. He throws it back in the garbage, like, he didn't want to have anything to do with that. That's what Vichy was. Now, my sources for most of the conclusions I've drawn are the two monumental works of William Elshire, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich and The Collapse of the Third Republic. So I have a copy of it here tonight. He was a newspaper correspondent. He lived in and reported on life in France starting as early as 1925. At that time, France had the most powerful army on the continent of Europe. Having survived the First War with the aid of the British and Americans, it was probably the most powerful nation on the continent of Europe. It had the largest standing army. In the prologue to The Collapse of the Third Republic, Shire attributed the decline of France from that point to the debacle of 1940 to these factors. He says, "I watched with increasing apprehension the Third Republic go downhill, its strength gradually sapped by dissension and division, by an incomprehensible blindness in foreign, domestic, and military policy, by the ineptness of its leaders, the corruption of its press, by a feeling of growing confusion, hopelessness, and cynicism." Republic kind of wobbled into existence after the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, when the German army of the Bismarck era had dispatched Napoleon III as the emperor. After the Germans withdrew, a provisional government called the National Assembly had been elected in 1871 and contained a large majority of delegates in favor of the restoration of the monarchy. But they couldn't agree on a king. There were two possible candidates. One was called the legitimate heir, the Bourbon group that had been deposed in the Revolution, and there was a interim king somewhere between the Revolution and the 1850s, 1840s, where there was an Orleans pretender who was on the throne, and there was a large majority of the delegates also, a large minority, I should say, of the delegates that really hoped for another Napoleon. They were ready for an autocrat to take over the government of France. And I'm reminded that a lot of the members of the French Enlightenment, including Voltaire, were always they weren't interested in representative government. They were always searching for a philosopher king, an enlightened despot, somebody who would rule under the enlightenment that they were searching for. And I think that's what probably a fairly good-sized majority of the people in France in the 1870s either wanted a new king or a new emperor. Not many of them, well, some of them were interested in a new republic. And as this went on, the stalemate went on until 1874 for 4 years. And there was a minority in the government that wanted a republic, and as time went on, the Republican minority grew, and finally they succeeded in establishing a Republican government over the staunch opposition of the army, the church, and the monarchists. The church believed that a republic gave the people too much freedom, resulting in a decline in morals. The monarchists never believed that the people were capable of governing themselves, and the army believed that the government required a strong national leader, that leader was essential, a strong autocratic leader. And so the republic, as I said, kind of wobbled into existence, but it finally was established in 1874. And you know, recently, I guess within the last few years, I read somewhere that the Russian Orthodox Church now is of the same opinion that people can be given too much freedom. And so they just ought not to have all the freedom that we think is essential for the people to live free lives. So those were the forces that were at loggerheads with respect to the establishment of government after the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. These forces remained alive and at odds throughout the whole life of the Third Republic. Maybe the deep divisions can be illustrated by 3 accounts of life in France leading up to 1940. The first event is the Dreyfus Affair, which happened in 1874. The Captain Dreyfus was an army captain, a Jew, accused of turning over secret documents to the Germans, who were still fairly hated in France. The church, the army, and the press started a campaign of outright lies, saying that Dreyfus had confessed his guilt, that he did it for money. He was a figure in a conspiracy of international Jewry to ruin France. And with the whole country in an uproar over this, it's hardly surprising that a court-martial found Dreyfus guilty and sentenced him to life imprisonment on Devil's Island. Only 5 years later did he succeed, his wife succeeded, in getting somebody interested in a review of his conviction. I'll bet most of you in years past, maybe you saw it when it originally came out, was a movie called, featuring Paul Muni as Émile Zola, the French writer who took up the cause and issued his famous manifesto where he accused everybody, just about in the government and the army, of framing Captain Dreyfus. Now, I don't remember whether the movie was called The Dreyfus Affair or something else, but it's a startling portrayal of Zola's courage as he was hounded and actually prosecuted for daring to accuse the military of railroading Captain Dreyfus on evidence based entirely on forged documents and perjury. Now, all the lawyers in the room will be interested that one of the chief bits of the evidence against him was a military officer who took the stand and swore that he had been told by an unimpeachable source that Captain Dreyfus was the person who turned those documents over to the German leader in Paris. They didn't even make him reveal his source. It was like he was a newspaper reporter and not required to reveal his sources. But hearsay evidence is dangerous, and so it we hopefully would never have happened in this country. Well, nevertheless, he was ultimately cleared, and many of his accusers either committed suicide or were jailed. Many of the zealots who had threatened to bring down the government if Dreyfus were to be freed continued to fulminate against the courts and anyone who said that he was innocent. He was given a new trial and convicted once again by a military court-martial and a vote of 5-2, but they had used a lot of the same evidence that they had used before, which all was based on complete forgeries and perjury. The full truth didn't come out actually until 1931, when the German officer who had received the stolen documents died and some of his private papers were published. He revealed that another officer by the name of Esterhazy was actually the guilty party. But even then, the account was not settled, as William Shirer describes in a footnote in The Collapse of the Third Republic. Not all the anti-Dreyfusards in France were convinced by the revelations in the Swartz Coppin papers. Swartz Coppin was the name of the German officer. In 1964, a book was published in France written by a French lady, I won't pronounce her name, the daughter of the former war minister, who, it will be remembered, had convinced himself that Dreyfus was guilty, despite the confession of forgery he obtained from a Colonel Henry, who's one of the persons who committed suicide later. His daughter was still convinced of that guilt, and with a stunning absoluteness. It may be true, as the historians have written, that no one who did not live through the affair can have the faintest conception of the fierce and ugly passions it aroused in France. But reading Madame Dardenne book helps. More than half a century after the event, she is as raucous and passionate and as blind to the evidence and the forgeries as any violent, hysterical anti-Dreyfuser of the time. To her, there's not the shadow of a doubt that Dreyfus was guilty of treason, that Colonel Picquart, who was one of the persons who helped to reveal the forgeries, Colonel was a despicable traitor and the most of the unsavory characters who, on all the evidence put before the highest French court, framed the innocent Jewish captain, were virtuous, patriotic heroes, fiercely devoted to the proof. And so it took a lot to convince the government finally that Dreyfus was actually innocent. After, in 1906, I think, finally, the High Court in France had quashed the second conviction, and Parliament actually passed an act which pardoned him of all of the crimes of which he'd been accused. But he'd spent 5 years on Devil's Island, and he was maybe a broken man by that time. They did promote him to major, and Colonel Picquart was made, was elevated in rank and made a hero. But in all of this, I mean, the Dreyfus Affair showed the deep divisions in the Third Republic. They just barely got along. They had government after government that were formed and dissolved, and a deep anti-Semitic strain was prevalent in France. And so there were a lot of problems with the government and in the French people themselves that were certainly not resolved by the adoption of the Third Republic. During all of this time of the Dreyfus Affair, there was actually a bill introduced in Parliament to expel all of the Jews from France. So it's not surprising that later on there was a real effort to collaborate with the Nazis after they had knocked out the French army. The second example of the life in the troubled republic started 25 years later. It's called the Stravinsky Affair. It involved a longtime swindler with astonishing connections in the highest offices of the republic. His skill was floating fraudulent municipal bonds. Now, those of you from Nashville know that we had some people at the same time who were very skillful at that too. Any of you that have read the, what was the Caldwell and Company? Caldwell in Nashville and the Bank of Tennessee was very skillful in also selling municipal bonds. So it sounds like something that we're familiar with. The son of a Russian dentist who immigrated to Paris around the turn of the century. From the time he was 22, Stravinsky was in and out of trouble with the law, always able to make money from one shady deal after another. He kept out of trouble by having friends in high places and by ratting out others to the secret police. Finally, in 1926, he got into real trouble when he was charged with fraud to the tune of about 7 million francs. And actually, he spent 18 months in prison. But he was released in 1927, presumably to stand trial, but he succeeded in getting a continuance of his case 19 successive times. He was never brought to trial on the charges that got him in trouble in 1926. Meanwhile, while he was out of prison, he was back at his old practices, dabbling in the newspaper business, racing horses, associating with his friends and the government ministries, police officials, newspaper publishers, and editors. On 45 different occasions, his shady affairs during this time came to the attention of the police, but never was he called to account. Finally, on Christmas Eve in 1933, a scandal broke over 239 million francs of the city of Bayonne's municipal bonds. The bonds had been handled by him in a fraudulent scheme. And that was so large it couldn't be swept under the rug. So he promptly went underground. The police apparently hoped that he would simply just go abroad somewhere and it would all be over. The secret police gave him a forged passport, but instead of going abroad, he just went underground. And finally, he was found in a resort city in southern France, and allegedly, as the police were breaking in to arrest him, he committed suicide. Now, there was a strong suspicion that the suicide was assisted by the police because he knew too much. And so that ended Stravinsky. But that set off in Paris about 6 weeks of tumult. There were marches on the assembly, riots in the streets. It brought down the government. The police had been involved in a lot of the chicanery, were kicked upstairs, and so it was a really tumultuous time. Apparently, it was really the French government was really corrupt. I guess that's about the simplest thing we can say, which didn't endear the Republic to the general population. They just thought they were all crooks, and so they needed a change of some kind. The Nazis were involved in the riots. The extreme left was involved. They all of the rioters wanted to bring down the government. And so it was really touch and go for a long time over this petty criminal that had such influence in high places that he was able, even though he was under charges of crimes, got out of prison and stayed out of prison from 1926 to 1934. Again, all the lawyers in the room would be amazed, I guess, that you had a client that you could get a continuance for 19 straight times with his trial set to be tried on criminal charges. You know, de Tocqueville said in the 1830s, America is great because she's good. And when she ceases to be good, she'll no longer be great. Apparently the French didn't learn that lesson because it seems that the Republican government, successive governments, were always riddled with some sort of scandal. The third thing I want to tell you about that was a real failing of the French government in the years between the wars was the development and use of tanks for the Army. It was actually the tank was actually essentially a French invention. The First World War had been in a stalemated position for nearly 4 years. And finally, in August of 1918, the French and their British allies, on August the 8th of 1918, started an attack on the German lines with a massive assault of tanks and artillery and the Air Force, all in conjunction. And General Ludendorff, the German general in the aftermath of the war, said that's what broke the back of the German army, was the devastation inflicted when this attack of armor destroyed about 5 divisions of the German army in a short period of time. Well, after the war, the French High Command apparently forgot about the importance of the tank to a modern army. All the high-ranking officials, I mean the really high-ranking officials, who were all old by that time, comparatively, thought that there really wasn't any place for the tank in modern warfare, and they would never be able to be used successfully against a strong anti-tank force. And so the French were content to build the Maginot Line and kind of sit back behind it, and never got around to even ordering the construction of mini tanks until about 1936. But by that time, of course, the German army that's the basis of their plans, was the use of the armored force along with the Air Force, the Stuka dive bomber, which was also sort of a French creation, where they were both being used by the Germans at that time. General de Gaulle was he was only a major then, I think, in the 1920s and 30s. Of course, was one of the voices that insisted that the government needed to establish these armored divisions. But the old general said, oh, no, they would never be successful. If they advanced 100 miles in a day, that would open up their flanks to a counterattack, and they would never really be successful. They believed, actually, that horses were probably just as valuable at that time as a tank was. That was really a failure of the Republic. And through the 30s, during the Depression, they had government after government that was formed and then dissolved. And so the whole government was in disarray. 1940. So who's responsible for the collapse of the French army and the French nation? Marshall Petain was not really in government until about 1934, when he seems to have kind of gotten bitten by a political bug. And then he became interested in political office. And he was a minister in the government in 1940. But when the Germans broke through and the government fled from Paris into Bordeaux as the Germans occupied Paris, he became prime minister on the 16th of June, 1940. And this is what Ambassador Bullitt of the United States had written to President Roosevelt was happening in Bordeaux before they moved up to Vichy, to the capital of the Vichy government. The impression which emerges from these conversations is the extraordinary one that the French leaders desire to cut loose from all that France has represented during the past 2 generations. that their physical and moral defeat has been so absolute that they have accepted completely for France the fate of becoming a province of Nazi Germany. Moreover, in order that they may have as many companions in misery as possible, they hope that England will be rapidly and completely defeated by Germany. Their hope is that France may become Germany's favorite province, a new Gaul, which will develop into a new Gaul. They were content to make peace with the Germans, and in a conversation with Marshall Petain, Ambassador Bullitt reported, he said he expected Germany to crush England rapidly, and he believed that Germany would make her chief demands at the expense of England. Germany probably would annex certain portions of France and would probably control the whole of France through economic arrangements, but he felt that England would be destroyed by Germany. He expressed great bitterness against Churchill and General de Gaulle. And that was a common theme of all the French leaders at this particular time. They really wanted to blame England for not doing enough to help them. And the anti-Republicans blamed England for leading them into the war and then abandoning them. And so I don't know where they got that idea, but that was the theme, that the Republican government was so weak and so corrupt that they got them into that war and they weren't prepared to fight it. Peace on June the 24th. They signed it after Petain became the prime minister. They signed the peace treaty with Germany. And one of the provisions of the treaty was, which Hitler insisted on, was that they would send back to Germany all of the anti-Nazi refugees that had fled Germany and come to France before the war started just to escape the Nazism of Hitler. You would imagine a large percentage of those were the Jews who had fled Germany. And so they held out for a day or two, but finally gave in. Hitler wouldn't hear any dispute with respect to that provision, and so they finally agreed to it. The person who really became the ruling figure in Vichy France was a former minister by the name of Pierre Laval, an extreme right-winger. I'd say he was as much a Nazi as Hitler himself. He became the Minister of State, sort of the gray eminence behind the Petain government, leadership of the government. And he really called all of the shots. And there was a proposal. At this time, there was still a republic, although the Parliament had voted to give Marshall Petain extraordinary powers to act in the emergency, and there was a proposal that the Parliament just take a long vacation and let the Marshal deal with everything that was going on, but Laval wouldn't hear any of that. His aim was to get rid of the Republic entirely, and he was successful in doing so. They just simply abolished the Republic and gave Marshal Petain power to rule by decree. Sentiment was not helped at all by the British destruction of the French fleet, which had made part of the fleet that had made its way to North Africa. And they were in port in a place called Mers el Kabir, I think. Part of the fleet was in England, in Portsmouth, and another port. Part was in Iran, part of it was here. they had succeeded, the British had, in simply seizing the parts of the fleet that were in England. I think the fleet that was in, part of the fleet that was in Iran had agreed to dismantle their ships, and so that they wouldn't be of any use to the Germans if they fell into their possession. But the fleet at Mers el Kabir didn't agree to that, and the British sent their ships in there and destroyed what was left of the ships there, and that was on the 3rd day of July 1940, just a few days after the Vichy government had made peace with Hitler. In July 9 and 10, Petain was given the power to rule by decree, and we don't have time to go through all of the collaborative efforts that the Vichy government undertook to collaborate with Hitler, but it was pretty severe. And at the end of the war, Marshall Petain and Laval and a lot of the others were also tried for treason, and this is the way William Shirer describes in his epilogue: of the principal figures in the last act of the drama of the Third Republic before the curtain fell, Petain and Laval were tried for treason after the war, convicted and sentenced to death. The sentence of the Marshal was commuted by the then provisional president, General de Gaulle, to life imprisonment on the island of WWII, however you pronounce that in French, where he died on July the 23rd, 1951, at the age of 96. Laval was executed by a firing squad in prison on October the 15th, 1945. He was 62. Others were accused, some tried, not a great number of them convicted. But it is interesting, I think, that throughout this book, William Shirer describes Marshall Petain as a near senile man in 1940 when he was 84. And as I was reading that, I said, well, hellfire. How many of us in here are almost that old? So, I don't know. I can't help my dad, anymore. And so it's still a puzzle to me whether he really deserved all of the blame he got. If he was senile, that may be a defense, and he was, in fact, under the thumb, basically, of Laval, who was the Minister of State and who was determined to get rid of the Republic, set up a strong central government, because he thought if you emulated Nazi Germany with a leader who was an autocrat, it would be easier to negotiate with Hitler after the establishment of the government in Vichy. I'm not sure that worked out too well for him. The Vichy government lasted until the time of the Allied invasion of North Africa in the fall of 1942. The Germans completely occupied France at that time, and I think that's when the rest of the French fleet which was in harbor in southern France, was scuttled by the French to keep it from falling into the hands of the Germans. By that time, I think people had begun to feel like maybe the Germans ain't going to win this after all. And so there was a lot more resistance at that point than there had been earlier. So that's the story of the Third Republic and Marshall Petain and Vichy France.